Ben Teitelbaum, welcome back for the third time to the Real Clear Values podcast. Ben, I'm just going to introduce you very quickly as a professor of ethnomusicology and international affairs at the University of Colorado Boulder. You have also written a few books, Lions of the North and War for Eternity as well, and you are a performer of Scandinavian music. You've got quite a few strings to your bow. As I say, this is the third time that you are visiting me on the podcast. I very much enjoyed the previous two conversations. I know that I got great feedback from the previous two as well from other listeners. This is the one. This is the trio, as all great fights or great contests have a trio, don't they? Whether it's Canelo versus Triple G or whoever else in the history of boxing. This one obviously is slightly different, but this particular conversation that we're having is one that I've really wanted to dig into for a while. Today we're going to talk about Aleksandr Dugin, who is a key character in your book, War for Eternity, and he features quite heavily in your research as well. So to kick things off, Ben, who is Aleksandr Dugin? Can anyone put a plausible label on him? There have been quite a few interesting, maybe outlandish, maybe not outlandish titles that have been given him, like Putin's Rasputin and various other things. So who is he?
That's the first question, and I think a preview for how complicated he is how difficult it is to answer that question. And there are multiple aspects to it. You could ask, okay, who is this guy in terms of just his professional status? What's his job title? And that's a difficult question to answer. And then the other deeper labeling of him, analysis of him, saying how does this guy relate to the government of the country in which he lives, Russia? That one is also very difficult. We can dismiss the idea that he is Putin's Rasputin, or at least that he has been up until this point. That is to say, he's not someone who is sitting in the Kremlin, who's sitting next to Putin at the end of these long tables, whispering secrets in his ears and directives and ingratiating himself in Putin's private life. By no means is Aleksandr Dugin that person, but neither is he a complete con artist who has built up a phony reputation for being influential when he actually is not. He is influential. The problem is that his influence is inconsistent. It has waned, and it has ebbed and flowed throughout the years. And it expresses itself in somewhat unconventional forms. You can think of an influential person, sometimes as someone who has an influential position, right? A president, a congressman, a senator, a member of parliament. Those positions are fairly clear in the type of power that they're meant to ascribe. But then you have someone who is an influencer, an intellectual, and that type of person you can't really quantify their influence. And Aleksandr Dugin is absolutely in that category for the most part. Occasionally he's had some formal things. So anyways, this is a very long-winded way of saying that we're dealing with a figure who's been discussed a lot in contemporary media, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And in that a lot of commentators recognize has some outsized influence on in Russian society, or at least in Russia's role in the world, and yet we can't quite decide on it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've read several different commentators write about Dugin and what they've had to say about Dugin, and it's almost like reading about a ghost. It's almost like they're trying to pin something down that just can't be pinned down. His identity, who he is, what he does, why he does it, all seem to be quite opaque and almost in their own right quite esoteric.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, if we take the basics though, because I like the way you characterize that this is a ghost. What are the unghost-like things about Aleksandr Dugin? We can say, well, he is a writer, he's a publisher, he emerged from dissident circles in the late Soviet Union, who espoused just about anything they could, anything outrageous and outlandish that was opposed to the communist regime. And Dugin was not, he was by no means high-ranking in Soviet society, but his father had a governmental post, and that gave him certain privileges and protected him in some ways. Nonetheless, He was persecuted by the late Soviet regime. And he emerged, however, with the fall of the Soviet Union, not wanting necessarily to be an anti-communist in the same way that he might have at the end of the Soviet Union, not finding dissidency there, but instead finding his calling in opposing Russia's then predominant push to turn westward. All right, the Soviet Union collapses and Russia, there are a lot of voices, as they've perennially been in Russian history, saying, okay, now we need to actually refashion ourselves in the form of a European nation state and liberal democracy. And that became Dugin's mission following the fall of the Soviet Union, to prevent that from happening. And he became less and less anti-Soviet and more anti-Western and anti-liberal and anti-democratic. That's what his book was.
Okay.
And throughout the years, his publishing and eventually his kind of pseudo diplomatic work was all pushed in that direction. So.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Just on that point, Ben, in terms of what he stands for and what he's all about, it's interesting looking at his book, The Fourth Political Theory. He actually writes on that. Well, his bio on that actually says that he has been an advisor to Vladimir Putin and others in the Kremlin on geopolitical matters, being a vocal advocate of a return of Russian power to the global stage to act as a counterweight to American domination. So he does have there is one of the things that is very clear to me, or seems clear to me, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm reading this right, is that it's not so much as what Dugin's for as what he is against. By way of definition, he defines himself more by what he's against, and what he is against is American power and something that he calls unipolarity. So tell us what Dugin's talking about here. What is unipolarity, and what is the problem that he's got with the liberal West and America in particular?
Yeah. So when the Soviet Union falls and there's this pressure to Westernize. He sees Russia as being one flashpoint, one scene in a broader global trend, which is that the entire world, every single speck of territory in the world is being incorporated into a global political, economic, cultural, spiritual system with the United States and Western Europe at the helm, but primarily the United States. And that system is liberal, secular democracy and Western capitalism, and so we can get into why he thinks it's not an accident that those ideas and those ideologies are combined with unipolarity, with an idea of complete homogenization and complete unification of a world where there is one pole, one driving force, and everyone else orients around it. He doesn't think it's an accident that idea is tied to liberalism and democracy and so on. But yes, that's what he's against. It's he ends up also being very much for something, but that emerges later, and we can talk about that. To me, evaluating his thoughts less as a commentator and more as just a private person, he's, like many people, much stronger in criticizing than affirming. When he starts to affirm something, he's a much more slippery ground. He eventually says that the opposite of unipolarity is multipolarity. Is a world in which there are multiple power sources that are all sharing space and influence with each other, and that respect each other's boundaries. And attendant to that also, that a true opposite of liberal democracy and unipolar liberal democracy is tradition, is worlds and societies that, instead of trying to expand, homogenize, instead of trying to develop and progress, are devoted instead toward continuity, toward holism, toward containment, toward integralism, in all stretches of the word, actually. And that is what he eventually wants to affirm. That's what eventually says, okay, Russia can represent in this new world not a competing globalism, not communism versus capitalism, not a competing modernity and economically and materialistically focused alternative to liberalism, but instead something genuinely opposite. liberalism, something that's anti-materialistic, that's anti-globalizing, that is instead self-contained, holistic, and devoted to being in communion with the past.
Yeah, interesting, because like you say, and it's a good observation actually. Many of us are better at attacking things or saying what we don't like, even if we're not attacking, we're just saying what we don't like, than actually affirming what it is that we do like. And that certainly comes through in Dugin's work and the role he's played in as a thought leader and as an influencer. So just to give us a flavor then, Ben, so this idea of multipolarity is the idea of having multiple power centers throughout the world, and he has been written of as a sort of spokesperson for disparate, varied anti-American groups that are all attacking American hegemony from some perspective or other. So just give us a flavor of the sort of people that Dugin works with and the sort of people he brings together in this anti-American approach.
Well, there are two things. There's the theoretical Dugin, and then there's the practical Dugin, because he's both written about this idea and he's done it. If I could start with the written, because that's an important flashpoint in his career. In 1997, he published a book called Foundations of Geopolitics. It was really his breakthrough into the mainstream. He had been trafficking in occult circles throughout the 80s and 90s, inspired by traditionalism, which I've spoken about on podcasts with you before, Tom. And but when he gets to 1997, he writes basically a handbook for the post-Soviet Russian world to counteract the West. And one of the things he suggests in that book in 1997, which is distributed widely, by the way, and it's read among the military elite of Russia and in its educational institutions. One of the things he prescribes is to try and support all divergent elements in American society. And he names, kind of Black Panther movements, minority racial rights groups in the United States, and white racist groups, the ones that would ostensibly be at the opposite end of that, trying to curtail American foreign influence. But his idea was, as you break apart the United States internally, you weaken whatever forces would make the United States whole and unipolar in and of itself. And that way, the United States, its global power would be diminished as well. So he recommends doing that in theory. And then what he ends up doing in practice is a sort of version of that. He eventually, by the 2010s, late aughts to early 2010s, he has really found an audience with the European far right. And that includes everyone from, let's say, the League Party, what is today called the League Party in Italy, to in Austria, the Freedom Party, but also to Jobbik, more extreme far right groups who are really at the fringe of the fringe in the European context. So Jobbik, Golden Dawn in Greece, those groups that are more typically called by commentators full-blown neo-Nazi or neo-fascist or something along those lines. They're all drawing toward Dugin. Dugin finds an audience in Scandinavia with the identitarian circles, which is a sort of offshoots and more difficult to categorize, but definitely on the far right and the radical nationalist territory of the political spectrum. So he's finding an audience there. He ingratiates himself in other parts of the world with the left, though at a much more minor level. He says, for example, in Latin America, that he typically sympathizes with the left. That's in the left in the Latin American context is anti-American in most instances, and positively disposed toward China and Russia and so on. And Dugin supporters in Latin America tend to affiliate more with the left than the right. In the Middle East, in the Caucasus, he has aligned himself with more Islamist forces. He was trusted as a moderator, in fact, during one of Russia's conflicts with Chechnya. And when he goes to Pakistan, to Iran, to Turkey, He's also warmly received by theocratic forces there, and again, we would see a sort of, so if you zoom out, you see a sort of union among Dugin's followers, or at least those who are willing to give him a warm reception. You see the radical right in Europe, you would see the left in Latin America, and you would see Islamists in Western Asia and in the Middle East. So all of them having in common some opposition toward globalization, modernity, and liberal democracy.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. I look at that, and it seems chaotic. Obviously, there's a kind of common thread that runs through it from Dugin's point of view in terms of his approach, his ideology, and what he's attacking more than anything, or what he's creating, you might say as well, but certainly what he's attacking. I just wonder as well about, and I've mentioned this to you before, and I find symbols and symbology fascinating, and Dugin uses the chaos symbol, and I wonder he's clearly trying to create chaos. Like you say, he's attacking the center of the West. He's working with people on the fringes, whether they be on the far right or the far left. And it just brought to mind that phrase, I think it was in William Butler Yeats's poem, The Second Coming, where it says, "The center will not hold." Joan Didion wrote about this in her essay Slouching Towards Bethlehem, when she talked about the decline of things in the 60s in Californian culture. And there was this question, can the center hold? So it seems as though Dugin's attempts, or his strategy, maybe his tactics, are to kind of pull apart the center by looking at these various different agitators, protesters, who can attack the center from multiple different parts, kind of like that chaos symbol where you've got all of these arrows going out, and I think it's in about 8 different directions. Yeah, something like that. So would you say that in some respects Dugin then is an agent of chaos himself?
We could say that. The thing is that he seeks chaos at one level, but he also valorizes order at a different one. Right? He thinks that liberal society, if you're living in it, one of its defining features is a menacing chaos. A satanic chaos is probably what he would be saying these days. And that's bad. And one of the benefits of, let's say, Russian traditional society is the existence of an internal order, and not a free-floating cavalier sort of unboundedness, unrootedness, which he sees as being inherent to liberalism, and Atlanticism, right? This idea that the Atlantic states bordering the Atlantic coast are just moving all the time and trying to progress and have no connection to anything. They're unmoored. So he doesn't, their chaos is something bad, but on a global level, he sees an order. He sees a unipolar order organized around the United States, and at that level of distance, chaos to him means breaking apart this homogenizing structure. And he often writes that the opponents of unipolarity are at a disadvantage because they aren't united. They're not as singular, not as coordinated as the agents of as the agents of unipolarity are. So they can't. An Islamist, a leftist, a far rightist, they all don't really like each other that much. But if he can bring them together, that's the only hope he sees for actually undoing the hegemony of the West. So that's it's that agenda of destruction at a greater level, which he thinks is going to predate a return to order and anti-chaos at a local level.
So chaos is a means to an end for him.
It's
along the lines of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or something to that.
Yes, we should say more specifically, chaos is a means to an orderly end, I think.
Okay.
Create a sort of global chaos for the sake of a local order.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So everybody's kind of got their place, and we don't want any American influence or Western liberal influence pervading that and interfering with that in any way.
Right. I mean, the way you put it right there, that it's true. at almost a level of abstraction, but remember also he thinks that liberal society is chaotic. So if someone is allowed to be not liberal, they're not only not just not participating in the unipolarity, but they might actually have a qualitatively more orderly society, because liberalism is inherently disorderly.
Okay. So that's
Right.
the philosophical Dugin then. So let's talk about more practical, more contemporary issues. So let's talk about Ukraine, because Dugin had some antics that he was up to in about around 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And from my reading, he was using this sort of tactic of supporting groups on opposite ends of the political spectrum in eastern Ukraine. Is that correct? And what was his involvement there? Because my understanding is that the way that things are now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Dugin might have advocated for something like that before Vladimir Putin took that action.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I mean, he was the way that he writes about the aftermath of 2014, it's almost a heartbreaking narrative on his part. When everything, I won't give a full history lesson here on everything that took place. I think a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, are caught up on that. But when everything happened in 2014, Dugin saw an opportunity, just as he had also in Georgia, not just for Russia to assert a boundary, but to perhaps push the whole country to shift its sudden change in orientation toward the West. Taking Crimea was good in his mind, but he thought even then that Russia really needed to take the whole Donbass, and that the Donbass was not just these smaller regions within the Donbass, but the entire Donbass was going to be essential to the preservation and the protection of Crimea. And I think he's right about that. Of course, there's some very kind of dry technical reasons for that. Getting, a land bridge, of course, if we can picture a map here, a land bridge that would bring Russia through the Donbass into Zaporizhia, Kherson, and then into Crimea has a lot of benefits to it. There's also the issue of water to Crimea. So he was attuned to all of those things, and thought that Russia should be asserting itself more. Now, of course, Russia did annex Crimea, but it didn't do everything that he thought it should have. And he said then, okay, this is akin to a sort of defeat. While he was working, what he was doing there, he had his own followers operating in eastern Ukraine, and he also saw thought that the Russian identity in eastern Ukraine needed to be supported, and that the Ukrainian supporters in eastern Ukraine needed to be extinguished in some way. And so he was interviewed one time. He said, what should be done with the pro-Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine? And he said, kill, kill, kill. That was seen as a call to genocide. There was a major pushback within Russia, in fact, against him at that time. He ended up losing his position after a mass protest at Moscow State University. Putin did not save him from losing his position in response to that, and it was a moment of fall and decline for him. So that's what he was doing in 2014. It was as if he got just a taste of what he wanted, to see Russia reassert itself, to see a boundary against the West reinforced in the way that it was in Georgia. But it wasn't. He didn't think it was sustainable, and from his perspective, I think he was right in that, of course. So I'll stop there. There's a lot of history, but that's what he started to do. What he saw in Ukraine was an opportunity to push back against the encroachment of multipolarity.
Yes, I was going to ask about
the unipolarity. Excuse me, sorry.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I was going to ask about the kill, kill, kill comment that he made, because that landed him in, understandably so, significant hot water. I just wondered as well about how does Dugin see Ukrainians in relation to Russians? Is he looking at, because I know, again, Nietzsche has been an influence of his. Are we looking at a kind of an Übermensch, Untermensch sort of thing here, where he sees Russians as superior to Ukrainians and others in Eastern Europe? Or
he would never put it in those terms, right? One of the hallmarks, one of the ways, and now we're getting into what he says is what he affirms, what he says is great about Russia. One of the things he says is great about Russia is that it is non-hierarchical among groups. It's a federation. It allows difference to exist without creating a hierarchy and without erasing differences. I have thoughts about that. But from his mind, from his perspective, he would not say no, that Russians are not greater, but he would say that it is the natural order in Eurasia for Russia to be the primary power hub, and that it is up to Ukrainians and those smaller groups on the periphery to orient themselves to that power order and that power structure.
Right. Interesting.
That's absolutely how you would characterize it.
Yeah.
So within that, I mean, does that mean that he thinks that Ukrainians are inferior? No, I guess not. Although I'm saying that almost as a formality. It seems to me that he does.
Yeah,
just
interesting.
out of that formal context.
Yeah, interesting. So I've read that Dugin has patronage, or he has financial support from others, from sponsors, if you like, from wealthy sponsors. Who are these people, and why do they support him? Why are they paying his bills?
We don't know all of them. The highest profile one is Konstantin Malofeev, who was I don't know if you want to compare him to Murdoch in the kind of Anglophone world, but he's an ultra-Orthodox, ultra-conservative oligarch, media mogul as well, and sponsors Tsargrad TV, this kind of far-right TV channel in the Russian context, which is in many ways that it's impossible not to draw some analogies between that and Fox News in the US context. He sponsored Dugin, and the two of them, there's a case to be made that the two of them, Malofeev and Dugin, have been a sort of clandestine arm of the Kremlin, that the Kremlin has found various ways to support or at least permit Konstantin Malofeev's activities in exchange for it doing some behind the table work for the Kremlin. That's one of the ways that someone could say that Dugin actually is doing the bidding of the Kremlin. There's some other ways too, but it's through that particular sponsor and in the unorthodox ways that the state interacts with the sponsors that Dugin ends up potentially doing some sort of state work. But that's the primary source. There have to be others. Like a lot of these Dugin-like figures, like Steve Bannon, like Olavo de Carvalho, the other two figures that I've written about, they have multiple sponsors who tend to give them lots of money, and they tend to have a falling out before too long. None of them can get along with each other for that great length of period of time. So.
Interesting. So with that in mind then, Ben, what sort of role has Dugin been playing since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year? Has he been trying to influence people and putting it forward that Russia isn't the bad guy here, that it's the West that's the bad guy, that the West has actually provoked Vladimir Putin into taking this activity? What sort of work has he been doing to promote Russian activity in Ukraine? I
think during the war itself, I think that his activities have been pretty fairly impotent, actually. He posts, and his social media followers read what he writes, but I'm not sure that he's done much there. Instead, if we want to look at his influence on this, we would have to look to the years predating it, when he did participate in a lot of lobbying with Europe. Europe is the epicenter for this, not just Ukraine itself, but all of the funders of Ukraine right now. And it is that coalition of Western forces, of course, which is enabling Ukraine to continue to fight. And those, Italy, Austria, Hungary, Greece, those states in particular are spaces where he for years had been working to try and make sure that the European far right was pro-Russia. Right. And he recognized that the European far right, as did his funders, you were asking about funders and Malofeev and the Kremlin, they saw in the European far right not just a random sideshow of kooks, but instead an actual force that was going to reshape European politics in the future, and that was worth investing in and trying to shape. And it wasn't just Dugin. Of course, Putin was making direct outreach to Le Pen in France, and the hope was the way we could see some impact of Dugin in what's going on now is if those European far right forces are more pro-Russia, more pro-Kremlin. And have Dugin's activities impacted anything? You would have to see Italy as a failure for him, because he had worked hard on Italy, worked hard on the League Party, and the Italian far right. And Meloni, her detractors aside, the current prime minister of Italy, her detractors aside, has been essentially, yes, a conservative, but also a Western pro-NATO, pro-democratic force. Came out yesterday, was one of the bolder statements against the attempted, whatever we would want to call it, in Brazil, has been a steadfast supporter of Zelensky, of Ukraine. So that has to be seen as a fault. Salvini, the leader of the League Party in Italy, he after having been very for being a Western political leader, very pro-Kremlin, pro-Putin, did a U-turn at the outset of the war. The war itself changed him. So if Dugin had built up momentum, it all seemed to evaporate immediately as it became politically suicidal in that society to be aligned with Russia. But what about Austria? There I wonder. It's not been the sort of thing that I can track. I could say specifically this comes from Dugin, because there's a lot of pro-Russian sentiment in the more conservative circles of Austria to begin with. But that's a place where he spent time, and it's also a place in Europe. We hear much less about it than Hungary in the context of geopolitics right now, in international politics. We hear a lot less about it than Hungary, but it's a place where pro-Russian sentiment and hostility and skepticism toward Western intervention in Ukraine is at its highest, I would say, outside of Hungary.
Yeah.
So that could be, we could see something of it there. Those are in terms of his actions, but of course, as a symbol, he's had a lot more to do with the war than that. You ask kind of what are the things, what are his own activities? How could they be contributing? But as a symbol, we had a flashpoint. It was in August of last year that his daughter was assassinated. And there's I think, high likelihood that the assassins were trying to kill him as well. It was a car bomb. He was supposed to be in the car with his daughter. Instead, he took another car, and that car blew to pieces. It was a very strange set of circumstances. The roof of the car is blown off, completely scorched. Her body at the open casket funeral appeared to be intact, very and by no means charred. So it's a very strange set of events. But one thing we can know for sure about it is after the assassination of his daughter took place, there was an international scramble to assign blame and to make meaning of the attack. And you don't do that. You had Ukraine, the United States, Russia, eventually all get in and offer their account of what happened. You don't do that over a nobody. Russia, at that moment, I think we all saw, and I hope that commentators paid attention to it, we all saw that this is not a nobody. If people treat Aleksandr Dugin as a symbol for Russian expansion and imperialism, then he is a symbol for it, and he has a voice. And as a result of that attack and all the international attention on him, he ended up getting more of a platform, given more formal endorsement from the Kremlin. And recently we heard that he was included among a group of philosophers who are being patronized by the United Russia Party in order to help articulate more of a philosophical mission for the state, the thing that he's been doing his entire career, but now with even more public, more official sanction from Russia's ruling elite. So that's, when you ask about his influence, even in this conflict, we've seen that it could be prior influence in intractable ways, and then you have this attack, which makes him more of a symbol, and then after that, you get some formal sanction. That has been his career. It has been this hodgepodge, this potpourri of accidental attempts, failed initiatives, all of it amounting to something. The ghost you spoke about earlier.
Yes, very, very, very ghost-like indeed, even in terms of his own ideas, and not to mention his actual actions and approach. So is it fair to say that since his daughter's assassination, he has ramped up his activities then?
Not he's not out networking in the way that he did before. And that, when he was, there was a period of time where it was China, Pakistan, Turkey, Iran, Western Europe. He was constantly trying to gather the forces of anti-Americanism and make himself a sort of hub. He's not doing that to the same extent. He seems to be grieving, as is understandable. I'd say maybe 3/4 of his public writing and social media posting has to do with his daughter. So no, in terms of his own initiatives, however, his stature, his profile has increased globally because of the attack, no doubt. So in that sense, he's a larger figure today because of him.
Yeah, very interesting. And again, that there are all sorts of different narratives and ideas, hypotheses about who actually carried out the attack. So yeah, again, that in itself, another ghost, so to speak.
Yeah, maybe I'm just showing my national chauvinism here. I am more convinced by the American account of it. I mean, we heard, first thing that we heard from Russia was that it was a Ukrainian assassin. It was a woman, who planted the bomb, and she happened to have, an ID card on her, showing that she was part of the Azov Brigade, this far right Ukrainian, much reviled and kind of a focal point for Russian propaganda about the war. This brigade in eastern Ukraine. She happened to have a card on her. She happened to bring her 12-year-old daughter with her along on the mission and escaped into Estonia. Ukraine said it was anti-Putin forces. The United States came out, and this was not long before the Kerch Bridge bombing, came out and said, no, it was Ukraine who did it. And the implication was that it was some governmental agency, but that might have been working more or less independently of the executive in Kyiv. And it was what it appeared to be was that the United States was sending a warning signal to Ukraine that we don't like when you do assassinations of this kind. And by the way, we're going to out you when you do it. That's what I think was going on in that instance. But the United States was unequivocal in saying, no, this was not anti-Putin Russian factions doing this. Instead, this was coming from Ukraine.
Interesting. So thinking about the United States then, Ben, I understand that Dugin in the past has given some sort of tacit endorsement of Donald Trump. Where do you think that stands now? This idea, there was an idea, certainly going back to 2016 and the run-up to 2016, that Putin and Trump were seen to be aligned. What's the status of all that now from Dugin's point of view, but also in the US as well? The people in the Republican Party on the right side of things in America, do they see an alliance still between Putin and Trump, or have things disintegrated since the invasion of Ukraine?
Partially. I think if you're looking for explicitly pro-Putin Americans, you will find them, you're most likely to find them in the Trump movement, the MAGA movement. That's where today the congressmen and senators who say they explicitly oppose any additional funds to Ukraine, that's where you're going to see them. Matt Gaetz, Josh Hawley, JD Vance. These are Marjorie Taylor Greene. These are Trump's strongest acolytes, and they've been the most vocal people against funding for Ukraine. And do they see an alliance between Trump and Putin? And does Dugin? Yes, I think so. The variable there is the status of Trump right now. It's not altogether clear to me what sort of political animal Trump is at this very moment. But Dugin was surprised. What he saw in Trump's election was an expression of what he saw as an anti-globalist, potentially anti-liberal or anti-expansionist liberal Americanism that he might not like in some other ways. He might disagree with its individualism and so forth, but that he saw as having the potential to coexist in a world with other powers, and that would share power on a global stage with others.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, yeah, sorry, carry on, Ben. I'll come back to this.
No, by all means, jump in.
I was just going to say, in terms of the point that you make about people blocking funding or trying to block US funding to support Ukraine, it very much has echoes of the original America First movement in World War II, the likes of Charles Lindbergh, the aviator, and various others who either had common cause with the Nazis or simply believed that the Nazis were going to win. America should stay out of the war, leave it alone, let the Nazis, let Nazi Germany take Europe, and we'll be out of it. It very much reminds me of that from my reading of that history.
Absolutely. There's a lot to be said about that. I think one of the most prominent public voices in U.S. society for the sentiment that you would look to draw that analogy is Tucker Carlson, who's not a politician but a media figure on Fox News. Fox News has been very divided about the Ukraine war. There's some commentators who were expressly pro-Ukraine, like Sean Hannity, and then you had Tucker Carlson, who's articulating this other position. And it's curious, as you go back in time, the types of arguments that were made against Ukraine from Carlson, they've evolved, and they've always needed essentially to adopt some of the talking points you just spoke about. At the beginning, said, oh, this is warmongering. Russia is not going to invade Ukraine. There's no way, and we shouldn't be scaring, and Biden is trying to distract us from his poor record. Then he invades. Okay, so they were wrong about that. And he's not going to try and take the capital. He failed, but he tried to take the capital. And then Carlson has been the one saying most of the time, Russia's just absolutely going to win this. They're just trampling over, kept showing the map early on with the expansion of Russian troops. Don't let anyone tell you that Ukraine can win. They're going to lose. Russia's going to envelop the country. Then you get Kharkiv, you get the whole oblast of Kharkiv, you get Kherson, and those arguments have just continued to kind of churn away. But one wonders about the source of it. Whenever whenever you watch a debate, for example, and you see someone giving reasons for holding a position, and that reason evaporates, and then they move to a completely different reason, and that one, and they move to a different one. The mind can't help but wonder, okay, what is the actual reason? If these are not consistent justifications, if you're willing to drop them and pick something else up, what is the consistent justification for that? So that in this, because I feel the same way when you hear the America First people in World War II, it's not as though individual arguments were all crazy, but they were jumping between justifications the whole time, as if there was something else that they didn't want to say. And I find myself pretty helpless, but to not start wondering about that as one follows this conversation.
Yeah, it is interesting, and it does beg the question as to what's really going on there and what the real reasons are. Just coming back to the bigger picture, Ben, how worried do you think the status quo needs to be in the West about people like Dugin, these Dugin-esque characters who are pulling at the threads, fraying at the threads of society and trying to create this chaos in order to break the center? Do you think that there's any real cause for the status quo in the West to be worried about these figures and their activities?
It depends on how you think about it. It's I'm deep down, I don't like people being worried about people. Uh, I fear like if I were to say, okay, Aleksandr Dugin is dangerous, then the response is, okay, well we have to get out and police ideas and conversations, because this is someone who traffics in ideas and conversations and in meetings and in interactions between people, socializing at a very general level. And I would be I'm also I don't want to I don't like that instinct. I think that's a dangerous place also for states in particular to be. Um, what is troubling about this type of figure, is that any sort of influencer ideologue is that they can survive through a lot of things that would kill the career of a politician, an economy, a state, an actor. Ideas and thinkers are much more difficult to track and respond to. I'll avoid using the word control here, and that's an issue. And the United States should also pay attention, I think, to the possibility that it could alienate such a large part of the world. One thing that is illuminated by Dugin's activities is that theocratic forces, the far left, the far right, might all be so alienated collectively by a U.S. model that they would join forces with each other in order to seek out some alternative. They could be stupid and foolish to do so. It could be that they're all imagining, a future in which they are, no, it's not democratic, and I'm the one in power. And that's the way most anti-democrats work. No one wants to abolish democracy and put their enemies at the helm of the authoritarian state. They all envision this alternative, and so they could be foolish to be joining forces with each other, and they might, I would say, they would all fare much better in a world with some democratic issue. But you can tell the thrust of my conversation right now. I do think that the United States needs to pay attention to its detractors and to the discontents with liberalism. And Dugin, even if we see all of the danger involved in his ideas, Dugin can help them think about that. It can be an impetus to think about, okay, how can we find better ways to coexist with some of these actors?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, so yeah. Sorry.
No, carry on.
Yeah. So that's one way to respond in a slightly less belligerent and dismissive approach to Dugin. So and that's I think a constructive way that the West can work about it. Where I take a more hardline, aggressive response to Dugin's ideas is in the idea that, again, not what he is criticizing, but what he is affirming.
Yeah.
His account of Russia up until this point has been that it is not as expansionist, not imperialistic, traditional, holistic, built toward coherence. I don't think any of those things are true. I didn't think that the traditional, the drawing toward collectivity, toward the sacred, I didn't think that was true of Russian society up until this point. It doesn't seem at all any more pious than any other part of the world. It seems less pious than quite a many other parts of the world. But the idea also that it's not expansive,
yes,
should absolutely be gone. The only way to maintain that argument today is through a lot of gymnastics, some really hard stretches of the imagination, to say essentially that what's taking place in Ukraine is not an invasion. It's just a reclamation.
Yeah.
And in that case, the distinctions of expansion and non-expansion hinge entirely on whether or not Russians say that they have a right to another people in another territory, which is meaningless to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's an invasion. So it's in those accounts, and the way that it speaks to Russian society to me is in some ways more dangerous than what Dugin has to say about the West. Not everything he has to say about the West is stupid, and not every not every message that is sort of inherent in his activities or that he's explicitly trying to send is something that we should dismiss as ridiculous.
Yeah, yeah, some great points there, Ben. A couple of things that sprang to mind as you were speaking. It reminded something that you said reminded me in terms of, we can't get into the policing ideas and locking people up for their ideas, because then we're not a liberal democracy anymore. So I'm glad you made that distinction there in terms of the extent to what the West can do in response to somebody like Dugin. But it reminded me of the cover of the Economist newspaper after the assassination of bin Laden. It had a picture of his face, and it just simply said, "Now kill his idea," or something like that. It was "Now kill his idea," or ideas. And that's the point, isn't it? The point is that the ideas remain. You can eliminate individuals. Sometimes you create martyrs of them, but the ideas remain. And this is why we have to take these things very seriously, and we have to deal with them as ideas, with other ideas, with a vision. And that's the thing. It's like going back to World War II. You look at how World War II was dealt with by the likes of FDR in particular, FDR and Churchill, but I think more particularly FDR, when he talked about things like the four freedoms and the arsenal of democracy. These are very, okay, there's an element of abstraction there, but that abstraction is very quickly reified by specifics. And do we have that now in the West? That is the question. Do we have that now in the West? I don't think that we do. I certainly don't see it in the UK. From what I see over the pond in the United States, I'm not so sure it's there either. And I think we are struggling for, like you say, going back to affirmation, where is that vision? The biblical phrase, "Without vision, the people perish." And I think that there is a vacuum at the moment of values where, key focus of this podcast, obviously, where people are fighting for that supremacy, that they're fighting for that pole position, which ideas are really going to make it happen. And I think that's probably where Dugin is as well. He's fighting on that ground. He's fighting against something that has been built, whereas the people who are in the house that's been built, so to speak, and not necessarily abiding by those principles. This is what we see with capitalism, isn't it? People attacking capitalism, but it's because capitalism is operating in almost in an anti-competitive way. You look at cronyism, you look at things, the abuses of big pharma and all these other things. So the sad thing is that it's all these kind of abuses of the principles on which the West stands give way to the alternative, or the antagonists who are pulling at the seams and saying this is bad, when in actual fact it might not be bad, but it's just not what it says that it is, or that it's supposed to be.
Right. And we don't even have to. I'm not a complete flag waver for liberalism in all ways, in all cases. I think it's a fine model, but it has flaws. But you have to know this was the problem with the end of history, with Fukuyama's claim that liberal democracy is clearly taking over the world, because what was taking over the world was not obviously liberal democracy. It was something else.
No.
Yes, absolutely. It's one of the weaknesses of this particular idea, though, liberalism, because the discussion we were having is a sort of general conversation, the same conversation you could have about communism, or what spread was, that's actually Stalinism, it's not communism. Had it been communism, it would look differently. But there are reasons to pull it out of the general. I think it is a lasting problem of liberalism that it doesn't affirm that much, that its principles are somewhat uprooted and disembodied, and we've known about that problem the whole time. It doesn't mean that liberalism should be scrapped in my mind, but it's a problem to manage, to be and to be aware of, that if we don't have any values, if liberalism is just a frame and a space, it may sound nice to somebody, but it's vulnerable as well. There's the emotional charge, and there could be truth. Not all values are equally good. I'm not a relativist in that sense. And if we never affirm something, you could be in a weakened position in a great number of ways. And so yes, I see that. It could be a product of the times, in the way that you were describing earlier, that in the UK and the US that we've kind of lost our sense. But there's also the possibility that this is more sewn into the DNA of of liberalism. Some of the early observers, let's say Tocqueville, looking at the early United States, himself coming from a place in France that was going in between an aristocratic and then a liberal order, and was going to violently transition, of course. He saw a need back then to try and pin down liberalism in something that it needed some sort of guardrail to keep it intact, and was looking to see some negotiation between an aristocratic order and a liberal order in order to achieve some of that, and also to achieve peace. Some sort of, I'm not saying that is the solution by any means, but I think it's something that liberal society needs to keep working on always, can never let up on, to say, okay, we yes, we affirm free and open discussion, we must affirm equality before the state and the law, and we see pluralism as a value in the grand sense of things, but how also do we counteract nihilism? How do we counteract complete uprootedness, the destruction of community in all ways? Those are conversations not to scream at as reactionary, but instead to try and work with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a great point you make about the inherent emptiness of liberalism, because it could be anything. It's giving people free choice. And I mean, I think about FDR's values. FDR's coming from a Judeo-Christian position, which is extremely unpopular right now. But when you look at that and you put that starkly against what Hitler was presenting, it did a pretty good job of counteracting that and getting people to focus on the what to many people will look like a good versus evil scenario. So liberalism does have an issue with that in terms of what are its values and who is going to sign up to things. It goes back to the other conversations that we've had as well. You know, critics of far-right critics certainly who've had issue with liberal democracy and basically say, I think it was Richard Spencer who said that the liberal ideal was dying in your bed with a pension. Nobody can get inspired by that. That doesn't lead anybody anywhere. That's simply a matter of creature comforts, and we know that people are not motivated by that. That does not inspire anybody whatsoever. So there are very big questions. I think the thing is, Ben, coming to kind of wrapping this up and bringing this to a conclusion, is that with people like Aleksandr Dugin and various others, I think you hit the nail on the head where you said that we have to take these people seriously. We have to take their ideas seriously, and particularly the criticisms. I interviewed somebody else on the show a while back. He was one of my first guests, and he was an emeritus professor from Brigham Young University in Utah. And he was actually a Heidegger scholar, but he taught Nietzsche, and I found it hilarious that there was teaching of Nietzsche going on in essentially a Mormon university. But his account of that was strong, because he said, well, we need students, particularly LDS, Latter-day Saint students, to come to terms with these ideas, to look at ideas like the Superman and will to power and the anti-Christian criticisms, and get to grips with them. Because what good is it if they're sheltered from all of these things, they don't have any contact with them? If you look at it even from a faith point, they're there intellectually in an academic pursuit, but even from a faith point of view, how good is somebody's faith if it never comes in contact with the opposition? So I think we do need to take these ideas seriously, and I think we need to make sense of them and perhaps not just repair the house that we've got, but maybe even build a better one.
Right. It's key to improvement, to moving to maturity, as well, to be exposed to this. I think, we have these discussions at universities. I'm a university professor, and why should we study bad ideas? And that's one of the explanations given by some of my colleagues is that, well, we need our students, this is actually, if the word weren't so maligned at this point, this is a safe space for students to encounter dangerous ideas, actually. And that resonates with me. I think that's true. I'm also motivated by the fact that I want to participate in the world as it is. I'm not interested in making a silo for myself. That just is, it's almost an aesthetic disinclination on my part. It gives me goosebumps when I think about, what if I just had some someone curating what ideas and words I'm able to come in contact with. But there's a deeper lesson too, in that I think there are very few people walking around in this world who have 100% bad ideas, who have zero insight to offer about absolutely everything. That's an idealization. That's a sort of lullaby we whisper to ourselves in order to justify some of the laziness, in order to recast laziness and fear that motivates us to keep people away from each other. Even someone like Dugin surely has something smart to say about something and can teach somebody something about themselves or about the world. And I don't want to, for any cause. I don't want to deny myself that particular opportunity. It doesn't mean in any way that the overall agenda of somebody isn't bad, or isn't really bad in some cases. But it's important to talk to people for that reason, and to not be afraid, and also to show some self-confidence in yourself. I think that if I think of the professor at BYU you're talking about, that person, I presume, also feels very very safe, probably, very assured, very confident in their own thoughts, and is not worried to change them, but is also not feeling like the entire world is going to collapse around them. In some sense, if they encounter ideas that threaten them, or that trouble, that offend them in some way, that same sentiment can be carried in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, brilliant, great conversation as always, Ben. Thank you so
much
for your time on the Real Clear Values podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.